So hi everybody, it's very nice to be here. My name's Kirsten Dunne and I'm a Senior Projects Conservator at National Galleries of Scotland in Edinburgh. Historically I was a paper conservator, but more recently my role evolved and I now look after a variety of things, including microfading, the conservation of our time-based media collection, and also starting to look at applications of technology to conservation. And I was asked to speak a bit about my perspective on what I think conservators can offer to educators and education departments. So hopefully this is going to be a nice mirror to Jeremy's presentation from the other side. I'm using what I know best and what I have access to, which is the work of my colleagues in the Conservation Department of National Galleries of Scotland. And I'm going to say from the start, and I don't think this is selling ourselves short, I think my colleagues agree with me, I don't think we're doing anything particularly groundbreaking or unique with our output. And there are incredible examples out in the world of conservation driven education projects. But I'm just hoping there'll be some sort of ideas and instigators for our discussions later this afternoon. So briefly, in case you don't know who we are a set of 5 galleries which form one organisation across the city of Edinburgh. We have 2 modern art galleries, a portrait gallery in the centre of town, a national gallery, and then we share a building as well with the Royal Scottish Academy, also in the centre of town. We also work with 2 partner organisations, one in the borders of Scotland and England and one in the far north of Scotland. We are an art-based collection. And our collection covers a wide variety of media and types that you can see on the screen here and dates from about 1400 to the current day. We are actively acquiring and also commissioning works at the moment. Our core activity is centred around exhibitions and loans, and that is the main drive for a lot of our work. So we have a conservation department within National Galleries of Scotland, 6 conservators, 5 conservation technicians, and we also have an education department who are excellent and do incredible output. But very rarely do we have the opportunity or create the opportunity to work together. And that's something else I'll say from the start. Generally, it's because we're so busy in our core programs individually, we've not got the headspace or the resource to find those time for those initial conversations to create the links, which is exactly what we're talking about today. And I think from a conservation perspective as well, because we have issues around the way we gather data in our databases, which is something else we're reviewing at the moment, we don't have the ability, sorry, to get the right information together into a format that we think could be useful. So this project is perfect timing for us, and I really hope will help us sort of bridge the gap that we find ourselves in, because we would love to work more closely together. So all the sorts of examples I'm looking at today are things that we do fairly independently of our education department at the moment. Converse to what Jeremy was just saying about working with sort of younger audiences, actually most of our work naturally seems to fit with older audiences at the moment, particularly sort of adult-based interest groups, university departments, and peer-led research groups. In this case, information sharing seems to be sort of a bit more of a two-way street, or at least it should be, but it tends to be based around something instigated outside of our organisation that then wants to use our collection or us as conservation professionals as a resource. So, for example, we've taught university level courses in museum studies or conservation training or our history, technical art history. They want to come and visit, they want to learn about us and what we do as a department. You might also then get researchers who want to use the information we create around objects as a resource in itself, or use us for physical access to individual objects on which they are interested in undertaking research. So the example I have on screen is one of our Van Gogh paintings, which was recently part of a research project led by the Van Gogh Museum, and it was an internationally led thing where people who had paintings from a related set of his work were asked to carry out the same set of analysis on each painting that we had. So we shared information we already had, we created a new body information that was then shared into this sort of central pot and joined together. It's a really beautiful example of linked data, really. Joined together, it then allowed this group of paintings to be seen in a whole new way. And I think that's a really beautiful example. So the resource here, and I think basically this is what I'm going to be saying in almost every slide, is that there's lots of different sort of varieties of resources I think we're presenting as conservators with this type of group. Us as professionals is one resource, conservation documentation that we write, being able to share that, and some of the imaging and analysis that we do as part of our everyday work. So as conservators, there's lots of imaging and analysis techniques that we have access to or would ideally like access to. And I'm aware I'm speaking to people who can explain this a lot better than I can, but for any non-conservators in the group, basically imaging techniques, the sort of imaging techniques I'm talking about at the moment, are different ways to view artworks effectively in different wavelengths of light. And they can tell us different things about the materials, the makeup, how object is made and its condition, and potentially condition history as well. So these techniques are very, very useful to us in understanding objects to enable us to undertake conservation treatments, but also then feed into a really interesting body of information around objects as a whole. We have actually a very limited set of techniques we have access to at NGS, and they're listed here on screen. And the example that I'm showing you is a watermark taken by one of my paper conservation colleagues, who is doing a very large project using our beta radiograph plate to image watermarks from works on paper in our collection. So a really useful data source and pool of information, which is creating its own database of information about our collection and how our collection integrates into Scotland and the world wider. But he's also sharing it into a centralized database as well. So again, another example of a sort of a two-way data. Something we really want to do is to move into multispectral imaging, which is much quicker than doing lots of different individual types of imaging. It does it all in one. And I'm using this because I heard of a really interesting example recently of an organization using multispectral imaging. Now what it does is creates an enormous amount of data really quite rapidly, because you've got all these different images and these different light sources that can tell you different things. And the issue for a lot of organizations is the time and resource to go in and interpret them all and describe what they think they're seeing. So I'm sharing this because there's a really lovely example of a print room in Denmark, and as I understand it, they were taking multispectral images of their collection and they didn't have time to interpret them, so they just released them back to the researchers in their print room and allowed them to interpret them. So this picks up on what you're talking about, Jeremy, about real live tasks. What do you see in these images and what can that potentially tell us? So I think that's potentially something interesting there. I think as conservators, we create a lot of information, but we also have resources in our studio spaces that are potentially quite interesting. I think there's something about us as a profession where we like to learn with our hands, and that can then translate potentially into education programs because people connect with things in different ways. So we have resources that could be useful for helping people understand the processes of making objects. So the example I have here is we've recently acquired a large set of frame makers' historical molds. So they're an incredible resource in themselves for people interested in frames history and their making, and in frames conservation. And we're currently running a documentation program with volunteers who we're building a lot of information about them. But these are actually objects that will then be used by our frames conservator to create suitable repairs and replicas for frames in our collection. So they're casting molds. So because they're hands-on objects that can be handled and used, most of our collection cannot be. They become an interesting resource potentially, in that we're in early conversations about how they potentially used in schools to make real something and actually take pupils through a process of making and casting from these molds. I think we also have an interesting skill base, which could be used in a similar way. So we often have the skills needed to create copies or replicas of things. And this is something historically we were asked to do once we have sculptures, a lot of sculptures in our collection by Edoardo Paolozzi. And so we were asked by our education department to make copies of several of them to become a handling collection for partially sighted and blind visitors to be able to interact with in an interesting way. So I think that's quite a potential interesting resource that we may have. think there's opportunities around events that we can potentially partake in that have a public face. I think conservation can be a bit of a mystery to a lot of people. It's often carried out behind closed doors, and this is something a lot of people are trying to change. So like many organisations, historically we've been involved in live conservation projects within gallery or publicly accessible spaces. Again, we're not unique in this. There's an incredible example at the moment with the Rijksmuseum Night Watch project, which I urge people to look up if they get the opportunity, and if we're allowed to ever move again around the world, go and visit. But historically, we did the same with Benjamin West painting, which was too large to get into our studio spaces. So in this case, our head of department, well, our then head of department, Michael Gallagher, who's now head of paintings conservation at the Met in New York, treated the painting, cleaned the painting in situ in the gallery space, and was available to answer questions. We've hopefully got another project like this scheduled for later in the year. Now, I think it's interesting because I think it, like you said, Jeremy, as well, it sort of matches across to not just the sort of natural initial link of art gallery, art-based curricula, but actually translate across into a lot of science and practical skills across all sorts of areas. I think one obvious output, and something we've always wanted to do, and I've seen great examples of before elsewhere, are conservation content-driven exhibitions. So at the moment we are redeveloping the Scottish wing of our National Gallery in the centre of town, and so we're undertaking a lot of concentrated conservation treatments and research around major objects within our collection. We've always wanted to do a conservation-led exhibition, but just don't have the staff resource and time to do it. So as an example of a real life project, we connected with a local further education college who have practical vocational skills, including exhibition design. And we set their students the task of designing an exhibition for us based on information we have provided around the conservation we've been doing. They've been to visit us and all sorts of things. And they're all designing an exhibition for us as part of their module, and the sort of winning exhibition as it was will be shown in the space once we relaunch our new Scottish wing. So this is another example of what Jeremy was talking about a real life project. Helped us massively. It also needed quite a lot of information to be gathered and put together, image-based information, but also factual text-based information, none of which was driven from our database, which is a shame. I think there's something about conservators as well, about us often being gatekeepers to a different type of experience with an object, and an up close and personal experience, particularly within art gallery spaces where you're often distanced physically from objects. Once you come into a conservation department or the world that conservators are working in, certainly within the context we work in, you can get behind the scenes and see things in a slightly different way. So the example you on the screen is well, people have mixed feelings about this image. It's a very Scottish image. This is the Monarch of the Glen by Landseer. So you've got a stag in a beautiful Scottish landscape. And part of the acquisition agreement was that we actively toured this work, which we did. Through a normal sort of touring exhibition to as many small galleries and museums across the whole of Scotland as we possibly could. But we also wanted to do something slightly different, and there's lots of primary schools who are unable to even get to their local gallery space, let alone our gallery spaces in Edinburgh, because we can be at quite a distance from people. So we took this painting to them in the back of our art movement van in a specially designed frame with a security guard, and small groups of students were allowed to come onto the back of the van in turn and ask questions and get up close and personal with this object. It was a really interesting experience. Everybody loved it, and this was a case where we did work very closely with our education department, and they provided all sorts of packs which the students then sort of went away with. But there's something we had to be very, very heavily involved in the logistics and planning for that and how that was going to translate across, and a lot of the questions we got were about those logistics. There's a lot of our work as well, I think, relates to understanding creative process, whether that's on a sort of philosophical level or a practical level. It's very important to our conservation practice to understand these things so we can make the right decisions for the objects that we care for. We have a really fabulous digital media department who is packed full of filmmakers always wanting to make films, and conservation is often a source, that's a department they want to work with. So we have worked with them on films around artistic process based on knowledge and information that we've created. The still you see on screen here is actually from a relatively recent film. So we have an installation piece in our collection, which is actually formed from 286 cardboard churches made to scale. And unfortunately, recently they had to be completely remade. The whole piece had to be completely restored. So this was a really interesting opportunity to record the process and talk to the artist about why they were doing things and how they were doing things, talk and interview the studio assistants. And so we documented the whole thing. So we've got two things here. We've got the raw data footage, all of it, which is a really amazing addition to the information we hold as an organisation, as conservators around this subject, but there's also the sort of outreach, the fact that resource could be used by people, but also the film that's then made from it. And this links sort of neatly into the idea of oral histories and artist interviews, which is something we're also involved with. So we often have to gather a lot of information around the construction of artworks, and when we're working with modern contemporary works, and so I'm thinking along the lines of performance art, installation and time-based media is a pretty good example of this. We often carry out artist interviews as part of our documentation process. So similar to the film I was just talking about, they talk a lot about process and technique and why certain decisions are made and what it means to be this artwork. And these are all recorded. So interesting raw primary material there that could be translated potentially in lots of different ways. We also have a potential project on the horizon. We have a lot of staff who've been with us since they were sort of, well, we've got a couple of curators and 2 conservators who've been on staff since they were 16 and 18, and they're now all approaching retirement age. So they have a phenomenal amount of anecdotal and institutional history locked in their heads, and our archivist is hoping to use an oral history program to get that out. So again, I think there's something there around that being a potential interesting source of information. So I think I've maybe just said the same thing in lots of different ways, but I think that there's lots that we as conservators do and create as part of our regular programme of work, things we need to do anyway that could really be interesting to translate across to education programmes. It can relate to technical analysis and art history, information on materials, techniques, processes. We can facilitate access in different ways. We can provide skills. We can talk about who we are and why we do certain things and provide this sort of different way of viewing things. But what we find is that we find it naturally fits more easily with older audiences, so adult-based learners, and it'd be really interesting to have conversations about how we translate this across all learning ages. And I just don't understand what educators need in terms of curriculum and what schools need in terms of when they're visiting. So having that link across is going to be really interesting, and I'm hoping this project will help with that. Thank you.